Welcome to some very famous people you've never really heard of. Bite-sized biographies of the famous, the infamous, and the quirky in less than an hour. My name is Philip D. Gibbons, and there is more information about me, this podcast, and a bibliography at bitesizedbiographies.com. There are also photographs of many of the individuals and items mentioned in this podcast. At the conclusion of Part 2 of this presentation, there will be additional suggestions concerning further information about today's subject, the former Arizona Cardinal and Army Ranger Pat Tillman. If you have enjoyed this presentation, please like us at our Facebook page, Bite-Sized Biographies. Subscribe to my YouTube page at Noblesse Oblige. Please note that all of Bite-Sized Biographies are now available on Spotify. And tell a friend about Bite-Sized Biographies. Now let's continue with our story about Pat Tillman. Within days, scoops and access were handed out by Wilkinson to outlets like the Washington Post, who, after being given access to anonymous sources in the military, embroidered this event with one of the first accounts of the convoy's mission and participants, Lynch's conduct during the convoy, and what befell her afterwards. According to an April 3rd article, Jessica Lynch fought fiercely, shot several Iraqi combatants, fired her weapons until she ran out of ammunition, sustained multiple gunshot wounds, had several soldiers around her killed in combat, and was seriously stabbed by Iraqi forces. A commando team was said to have engaged Iraqi military during both incoming and outgoing operations to rescue Lynch. A special ops officer was also quoted as saying the hospital's basement contained an Iraqi torture chamber. Additional reports soon circulated implying that Lynch had been beaten and even raped. These reports were accompanied by official U.S. military footage of the rescue, which turned Jessica Lynch's ordeal into a dominant media event for several weeks. Every major American newspaper and media television outlet, including Katie Couric on the Today Show, repeated this information, practically verbatim. One of the 4 Washington Post reporters who wrote the initial story, Vernon Loeb, even appeared on NBC's Dateline to explain that U.S. government officials had actually received their information on Lynch's ferocity from Iraqi intelligence sources on the ground. These accounts from actual Iraqi combatants who were, quote, stunned by her fierce resistance. In all accounts, the fighting that precipitated Lynch's capture was described as an ambush, with no mention of the mistakes made that actually led to the incident. It would take weeks and even months for the actual circumstances of Jessica Lynch's ordeal to emerge. Because her gun jammed, she never fired a shot during the firefight that resulted in her capture. The only fatalities she witnessed were those that occurred during the Humvee's crash into the vehicle in front of her. Her sole injuries were broken bones also suffered during the crash, and she was not shot, stabbed, beaten, tortured, or raped at any time. In fact, hospital personnel treated her as a priority, with dignity, and several attempted to facilitate her removal by U.S. forces. Much later, it was determined that an armored column that also got involved on March 23rd in rescuing some of Lynch's convoy had been victimized by American friendly fire when it was repeatedly attacked by U.S. A-10 Warthogs, bombing and strafing that resulted in the deaths of 18 Marines. When journalists and even families of the victims began to question official accounts of this debacle, the military was tight-lipped, even claiming that video footage from the machine guns of the A-10s used had been taped over and was unavailable. Although eventually it was determined that a substantial number of Marines were killed by friendly fire during this incident, the official routine investigation ordered by Commanding General Tommy Franks stated a year later that only one soldier died as a result of this mistake, an assertion the military itself knew was a gross understatement. At the time, Jim Wilkinson also attempted to spin the casualties as a result of numerous Iraqi combatants feigning surrender and then treacherously attacking U.S. soldiers, an account provided by a U.S. brigadier general in an official CENTCOM briefing. 2 days later, Donald Rumsfeld offered the same explanation in a briefing at the Pentagon. Eventually, the American public soured on the war, but at the time, in the first days of the Iraqi invasion, this type of public relations spin was wildly successful in maintaining support for a massive military operation. Stationed only miles away, Pat Tillman merely commented in his journal that he was glad that Lynch was rescued. He had no idea that the lessons learned in implementing the Jessica Lynch hoax by the Bush White House and U.S. High Command would eventually be repeated in a manner that involved him personally. The media spectacle surrounding the Iraq invasion continued to unfold as American troops successfully entered and occupied Baghdad. On April 9th, another media-driven event occurred when a massive statue of Saddam Hussein was pulled down by an American M88 armored vehicle in the capital's Firdos Square. Broadcast globally with a crowd of seemingly joyful Iraqis, in actuality, tight camera framing, U.S.-installed loudspeakers amplifying noise, and digitally altered photographs underlined that this was anything but a massive and spontaneous demonstration. The Tillmans were also in Baghdad at the international airport, deposited in a hangar where they uneventfully spent the next month and a half. They did have the occasional patrol, which consisted of kicking down the doors of terrified civilians, none of whom harbored anything of note. It quickly became clear, even to their commanders, that Pat's unit's presence was superfluous. Because Army Rangers rotate in and out of assignment after 3 months in a combat zone, the Tillmans were temporarily reassigned back to Fort Lewis for a 2-week leave, and then the final piece of their training, Ranger School. This was a 2-month physically punishing ordeal that exposed Army Rangers to the types of physical challenges, deprivation, and difficult environmental conditions they might be potentially exposed to in a combat situation. For Pat and Kevin Tillman, Ranger School began at Fort Benning on September 29, 2003. Although half of their 253-man group did not make it, as former professional athletes, the Tillmans were well suited to such a physical challenge, and both successfully completed this training. They received what was known as their tabs, a literal small piece of cloth affixed to a uniformed soldier, emblazoned with the word Ranger. Both brothers now fully vetted members of an elite combat unit. A promotion to specialist and a 2-week Christmas leave also ensued. Coincidentally, while stateside during this time period, Pat Tillman received an unexpected phone call from his agent, Frank Bauer. Apparently, Bauer had heard from Bob Ferguson, the former Cardinals GM, who was critical to Tillman winding up at Arizona. Ferguson was now GM in Seattle, and he expressed interest in signing Tillman to the Seahawks, adding that he believed that as Pat had signed under special circumstances, had already served in a war zone, he was eligible for an early discharge. Bauer also fielded interest from several other NFL teams and determined that Ferguson was correct, and Pat, if willing, could leave early. He spoke with Tillman during Pat's leave and got a very predictable and swift answer. No, not only because he would have to leave his brother behind, but it also meant that Pat would have to quit on his 3-year commitment. That was the deal he had made. Bauer half-heartedly tried to change Tillman's mind, but knew he was wasting his time. Pat Tillman would never go back on his word. It was March before the Army decided what to do with Pat and Kevin Tillman's unit. Instead of Iraq, they were headed to Afghanistan, slated for an early April departure. On April 9th, they landed at Bagram Air Base, a facility built by the Soviets in the 70s, about 25 miles north of the capital, Kabul. The base was surrounded in the distance by the impressive 15,000-foot peaks of the Hindu Kush, but the immediate territory contained wrecked buildings, rusted, destroyed military equipment, and even thousands of mines left behind when the Russians left Afghanistan. Now a new superpower was intent on bringing all of the volatile elements of Afghan and political society to heel. What exactly this mission looked like on a day-to-day basis was a work in progress. The first element in engaging the Taliban was to actually locate them physically. To that end, the Tillmans were flown over 100 miles into Khost province, a remote but strategic area that bordered Pakistan and was a hotbed of Taliban activity. After the invasion of Iraq, the U.S. military in Afghanistan, after routing bin Laden, al-Qaeda, and the Taliban and sending them over the border into Pakistan, relaxed into a passive posture which allowed these hostile entities to rearm and reorganize into a substantial entity. Realistically, American units would wander around this area, hoping to find and encounter such hostiles in order to engage them in firefights, patrolling through potentially antagonistic border towns and villages and possible Taliban enclaves. The Rangers hoped to find and eliminate this new threat. These patrols consisted of a column of U.S. military Humvees and support vehicles making their way through narrow, unpaved roads, frequently surrounded by tall cliffs. In the early morning of April 14th, Tillman's unit of Rangers, the 2nd Platoon of A Company, 2nd Battalion, 75th Regiment, about 40 men, was choppered into Forward Operating Base Salerno, an outpost closer to the object of their assignment. FOB Salerno was merely a staging point, and in a short time, A Company loaded up their transport and headed further into the interior of Khost province. For approximately 25 miles, they stuck to the only paved road in the area, but eventually turned off onto a dirt road heading towards the frontier and Pakistani border, less than 20 miles away and 70 miles from Kabul. Soldiers paralleled the ridgelines of the column that remained on the dirt road that made its way through various hamlets and settlements. Nothing of any note was found. The activity so non-threatening that members of the company were concerned that they would get through the entire 2-week exercise without even firing their weapons, preventing some, including the Tillmans, from achieving a combat infantry badge, another Army rite of passage. On April 20th, A Company experienced the first difficulty of the mission, a Humvee refusing to start. A company mechanic spent most of the day trying to fix the vehicle to no avail. The whole column remained in place, down to some of their last rations of meals ready to eat, their exit back to home base delayed by this issue. The next morning, the mechanic gave up and merely had the disabled vehicle strapped to another functioning Humvee with a tow rope. This jerry-rigged solution fell apart only about 5 miles down the road when the front steering mechanism of the disabled Humvee virtually disintegrated, making it extremely difficult to even drag. At midday, the company commander, Lieutenant David Uthlout, contacted FOB Salerno in an attempt to determine a solution. He was told that by no means should he abandon the vehicle, and it was up to him to get the Humvee back to the paved road where it would be removed by a wrecker. While Uthlout mulled that over, a local citizen approached and offered to tow the Humvee if he could get paid, the Afghan having access to a 5-ton truck that was able to haul heavy loads. With that problem solved, Uthlout was confronted with an additional challenge. His orders called for him to enter and clear one more village named Mana. The delay with the broken-down Humvee placed the A Company behind schedule, and the unit would also have to escort the truck towing the disabled Humvee. Uthlout requested that, so close to darkness, the Mana mission be scrapped and that the column first escort the Humvee and then return to Mana. Instead, he was told to split his column, sending half with the broken-down Humvee and the other half in the direction of Mana. Despite his protests that this would leave both columns more vulnerable in the event of any Taliban presence or even attack, the order was reiterated. The focus at headquarters was more in line with an insistence to sticking with a bureaucratic schedule as opposed to a sensible and safer implementation that might take more time. It was 6 o'clock when Oothlaut briefed the company on their immediate orders and then split his column into 2 parts. Column 1 with Oothlaut, Tillman, and 6 vehicles went in a left direction, heading towards the village of Mana. Initially, Column 2, commanded by Sergeant Eric Godek, with 5 vehicles at the same fork in the narrow passageway they were navigating, turned right. But very quickly, the Afghan truck driver explained that the upcoming route was much more difficult than merely heading to Mana, and then taking another turn that would bring the column to the beginning of the paved road, their ultimate destination. This they did, the truck towing the Humvee in the lead, the other vehicles behind, but this now put Column 2 directly behind Column 1. Column 1 had already traversed this extremely narrow, treacherous stretch of roadway, high cliffs providing excellent cover and protection for a potential attack. As Column 2 reached the same position at 6:34 p.m., there was an explosion in between the truck and the first Humvee. Initially, it was thought to be an IED. A second explosion hit the side of the canyon, showering the vehicles with rocks and debris. It was an attack with mortars, the best defense, a rapid exit from the area. Instead, the Afghan truck driver stopped in place, holding up the entire column. Greg Baker in the second vehicle behind the truck then ran up, got into the cab, and got the driver to start moving. The column could only move slowly as the rugged terrain only allowed a maximum speed of about 5 miles per hour. The convoy made its way through the canyon, U.S. soldiers shooting wildly at what they thought were Taliban figures on the ridgeline. About 3/4 of a mile after the first mortar round exploded, the canyon expanded, allowing the truck to pull off to the side and the other vehicles to pass. Column 1 was stationary and had cleared the narrow portion of the canyon when they heard the mortar explosions directed towards Column 2. 12 of the 20 U.S. soldiers in the first group immediately began ascending the ridgeline, intending on heading in the direction of the sound of the attacks, the remainder staying with the vehicles. Once they reached the top, they split into groups, finding cover wherever possible, as at least one Taliban fighter began firing at them from across the canyon. The Americans then came to a small collection of huts containing mostly women and children. A few yards beyond this encampment, most of the group stopped once they reached the crest of the hill. Tillman, Brian O'Neill, and an Afghan National Army soldier named Syed Farhad continued forward and downward to some cover behind 2 large rocks. The Afghan National was one of several such troops assigned to the company, mostly to provide help with translation. To Tillman's rear was a squad led by Matthew Weeks and another group consisting of Umlauth, taking cover behind one of the buildings in the village. For a few minutes there was no obvious hostile fire, and then, only about 30 feet from Russell Bear, a soldier in Weeks' unit, a rocket-propelled grenade exploded. It did not wound him seriously, but was close enough to blow out his eardrum. Another grenade exploded near other U.S. soldiers. These were accompanied by rifle fire, shots audibly whizzing through the air. Weeks and his unit were able to drop below the crest of the hill, successfully avoiding this assault. Unfortunately for Tillman's group, their boulder cover, while 6 feet long, was only about a foot high, and they were in a kneeling position. It would have afforded a perfect view of the widening canyon and the first 2 vehicles entering into view. Unbeknownst to Tillman, it was Column 2 that had fired the grenades in their direction, and the second vehicle, an open-air Humvee with 6 Rangers and an Afghan, led by Staff Sergeant Greg Baker, continuing to fire their weapons in Tillman's direction. Later, O'Neill stated that at first the fire was random and intermittent, and he and Tillman yelled that they were friendly, and it seemed to stop. From below, Greg Baker was able to observe the AMF fighter firing across the canyon at what Farhad believed was the original Taliban mortar position. Farhad was actually trying to provide suppression fire, but observing a bearded man with an AK-47, Baker presumed that he was shooting at him. From 65 yards away, in the front seat of his Humvee, Greg Baker, through a rifle scope equipped with a red dot laser sighting, quickly fired 6 shots at the AMF soldier. Two hit Farhad in the chest fatally, and he fell to the ground. Because squad members are trained to fire in the same direction as their squad leader, other individuals in the Humvee began shooting towards the hillside, raking the entire area with a barrage of gunfire. This despite the fact that the driver of the vehicle, Kellet Sayre, saw the 6 Column 1 vehicles parked up ahead and recognized the soldiers on the hillside as fellow Rangers. He began yelling at the other participants to cease fire, but the din of the weaponry and the confusion of the moment prevailed. Hundreds of bullets emanated from the vehicle, including gunfire from Will Akers' 240 Bravo machine gun, as well as another grenade. The grenade exploded close enough to Umlaut to cause severe lacerations to his face and mouth. A machine gun bullet also hit his team member Jade Lane in the knee and shoulder. Despite a complete lack of any actual hostile shooting at Column 2, additional gunfire was directed at the entire hillside for more than a minute after Farhad was shot to death. Numerous rounds were directed near the position of Tillman and O'Neill, and Pat finally decided to toss a smoke grenade down the hill. The shooting paused long enough for Tillman and O'Neill to stand up, thinking the worst was over, but the gunfire quickly resumed. Tillman was hit directly in the chest, but because he was wearing body armor, he was merely knocked to the ground. O'Neill and men in Weeks' unit began to hear him distinctly yell, "What are you shooting at? I'm Pat Tillman. I'm Pat fucking Tillman." By now, the offending Humvee had driven further into the canyon and was no more than 120 feet from Tillman's position. Most of the gunfire, directed incorrectly, emanated from the right portion of the vehicle. But SAW machine gunner Trevor Alders on the left side of the vehicle was trained to focus on the area directly in front of him. But perceiving that any threat was on the hillside to the right, he decided to train his weapon in the same direction, a machine gun that can fire 16 rounds a second, accurate to a half a mile. He fired 2 quick bursts of 10 rounds at what he said he thought later was a stone wall. 3 of these bullets hit Pat Tillman in the forehead, killing him instantly. Brian O'Neill frantically attempted to squeeze low enough to the ground to avoid additional gunfire. Hearing what he thought was running water, he called out to Tillman but got no response. As best as he could, he looked at Pat's direction where he saw a massive bloodstream and bone and tissue fragments. At that point, he just began screaming for help at the top of his lungs. Baker's Humvee did not stop shooting until it reached the parked vehicles of Column 1. The time was 6:48 p.m., the entire incident lasting 14 minutes. Sergeant Wes Ward, a member of Weeks' team, could hear O'Neill and realized he was in some kind of extreme distress. Both he and Weeks made their way to O'Neill and Tillman's position to investigate. With Column 2 having ceased firing, other Rangers quickly made their way to this position. O'Neill was already yelling at his comrades that it was our guys that did it. They fucking killed him. Ward, who had spent much of the afternoon in conversation with Tillman during the various delays, was so overwhelmed he began hugging Tillman and sobbing. Even 4 years later, while giving testimony during a formal investigation, Ward, a staff sergeant and U.S. Army Ranger, was unable to control his emotions when describing what he did and observed. Weeks took charge, told O'Neill to pull himself together, and posted him to a nearby location to provide security and also to get him away from the immediate area. He reported in code to Eric Godek over radio 1 soldier killed in action, last initial T. Weeks then began the process of removing the body, ordering some soldiers to get some ponchos to wrap and carry Tillman down the hill. Just as these soldiers got to the column, Kevin Tillman's Humvee arrived, parking behind the other vehicles. When Kevin heard there was a Ranger killed in action, he asked who it was. Not wanting to tell him, the nearby soldiers said they didn't know. Eventually, after he couldn't locate Pat, he directly asked other soldiers where he was. Finally, knowing that Kevin would find out eventually, and after Pat's brother repeatedly asked him directly, Sergeant Jason Parsons told him that his brother was dead. Kevin was silent for a few seconds and then began yelling obscenities. He was so overwrought that Parsons had the unit medic take his gun away from him, concerned as to a potential suicide or worse. 2 Black Hawk helicopters were ordered in to retrieve the bodies and also get both Lane and Umlaut seriously wounded to safety. It was 7:58 when they arrived, the area now dark. All of the occupants were taken to the hospital outpost at FOB Salerno. An hour later, another helicopter arrived and retrieved Kevin Tillman. The rest of A Company spent the night in the field, and the next day they patrolled and cleared Mana and the surrounding areas. Back in Seattle, Marie Tillman was working at her job at a public relations and advertising talent acquisition firm. At 5 p.m. Pacific time, she was asked to come to a conference room. Within minutes, a master sergeant and chaplain entered. The officer first inquired as to whether she was Marie Tillman, married to Specialist Patrick Tillman. When she said yes, he informed her that her husband had been killed in action in Afghanistan earlier that day. Marie first inquired about Kevin Tillman and then asked how it happened. The sergeant responded only that it was in an ambush and he had been shot in the head. With the Army also on their way to Danny Tillman's home, Marie felt it important that someone in the family tell her what had happened. When Marie finally got Pat's mother on the phone and gave her the news, her wailing was so loud that her neighbors, close friends Sid and Peggy Melbourne, came running next door as Danny Tillman emerged from her home into her driveway, overwrought. Within minutes, her son-in-law, Alex Garwood, sent by Marie and a female representative of the Army, also pulled up in front of her home. This individual informed Danny officially of Pat's death and, when asked, also notified her that Kevin was safe. Danny then had to call Pat Tillman Sr. to let him know, and he came to the home shortly afterwards. That same night, Marie's parents and sister to be with her during the initial aftermath of her husband's death. Back in Afghanistan, the Army was also addressing the aftermath of Pat Tillman's death. All external internet and telephone communications from FOB Salerno were disabled. This was normal to avoid news of the death of an individual soldier being disseminated before a family member was notified. By early morning of April 23rd, several high-ranking officers of the 2nd Ranger Battalion were on the scene, and after interviewing some of the participants, they quickly determined that Pat Tillman was the victim of fratricide. Lieutenant Colonel Jeffrey Bailey, commander of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, then passed this news up the chain of command until it reached the head of Joint Special Operations Command, Brigadier General Stanley McChrystal. In 2009, McChrystal would be the high-profile commander of all forces in Afghanistan, but at this moment in time he was only in charge of JSOC, the official entity that commanded and operated the high-risk counter-terrorist actions of the Delta Force, Navy SEALs, and Army Rangers. Fittingly, it was his unit that coordinated the rescue of Jessica Lynch. Held in high esteem at the most senior levels of the government, McChrystal was in frequent contact with Secretary Rumsfeld and Vice President Cheney. McChrystal would have immediately grasped the importance of not only Tillman's death, but also that he died as a result of friendly fire. He informed both of his bosses, Lieutenant General Philip Kensinger and General Brian Brown. He also sent this information to other high-level Pentagon and White House officials. McChrystal also ordered those on the ground in Pat's unit to say nothing of how Pat died and to instruct lower-level soldiers to keep quiet. By the afternoon of April 23rd, Kevin Tillman and the coffin of his brother were on their way from FOB Salerno. At no time had anyone told Kevin of the actual circumstances of Pat's death, and despite his repeated request for someone back at the scene to retrieve Pat's handwritten journal, it was never forthcoming. Instead, counter to normal Army procedure, Pat Tillman's uniform, body armor, and the contents of his pockets, which included the journal, were removed, placed in a trash bag, and burned in an oil drum by a Salerno FOB sergeant, ordered to do so by a base captain. Tillman's body should have remained clothed, his uniform only to be removed during any ensuing autopsy. By the time Kevin and Pat Tillman's platoon reached FOB Salerno, every member knew of the fratricide. From Bagram, Kevin Tillman repeatedly called this frontline outpost, trying to get a first-hand account from Brian O'Neill. Unable to get O'Neill on the phone, he asked to speak with Lieutenant Colonel Bailey, the battalion commander, who eventually allowed O'Neill to speak with Kevin, but not before strictly warning him to say nothing of the friendly fire aspect of Pat's death. Instead, O'Neill spoke of seeing the Afghan soldier hit, and then, while they were running up the hill, they were shooting back, and eventually Pat got shot, but he didn't really remember anything after that. Kevin Tillman, having not been present during this aspect of the firefight, would have been unable to understand whether this was an accurate rendition. By April 26th, Pat's remains had been flown from Afghanistan to Dover Air Force Base in Dover, Delaware. He was accompanied by his brother and another unit member, Russell Baer, who was friendly during his tenure with both Tillmans. But Baer, like everyone else in the unit, knew that Pat had been killed by friendly fire. He was also warned to say nothing to Kevin or anyone else about what he knew. On the flight home, Kevin was so devastated the two men barely spoke. Ordinarily, an autopsy is performed at Dover, but when they were confronted with Pat's uniformless remains, an egregious violation of protocol, the alleged details of the soldier's death which omitted any mention of friendly fire, and the wounds they observed, the two medical officers involved, including Army Chief Medical Officer Greg Mackel, refused to sign off on the official autopsy. They also took the additional step of informing the Army Criminal Investigation Department, the CID, that the Tillman situation was suspicious. Not only were McChrystal and others violating Army regulations by obscuring the fratricide, they were obligated to involve the CID if fratricide was even suspected. The CID did ask questions of some of McChrystal's subordinates, but the agent involved only met personally with the Rangers' relevant regimental judge advocate. This individual, Charles Kirchmeier, was fully aware that a preliminary investigation indicated that fratricide occurred, but he advised others not to say anything about it, and in his only interview with the CID was so deliberately disingenuous that any further investigation was dropped. In Northern California, the family received Pat's body on April 28th and cremated it on April 30th. On Monday, May 3rd, a public memorial was scheduled for the San Jose Municipal Rose Garden. While preparations were made for this event, Stanley McChrystal was feverishly meeting with individuals at Salerno FOB to review documentation. His intent was to award Pat Tillman a posthumous Silver Star. These documents included witness statements from Brian O'Neill, who after submitting it refused to sign the rewritten and embellished account, and Mel Ward, who upon a subsequent investigation claimed the statement he is alleged to have written was unfamiliar to him and also unsigned. These documents, which omitted any mention of Tillman's death by friendly fire, were submitted to the Secretary of the Army, Les Brownlee, who immediately granted the award, with no idea that the medal was based on faulty documentation. When the chief medical examiner, Greg Malik, got wind of the Silver Star and even read the documentation, he warned the Army's Office of Personnel that the award was extremely problematic. He was ignored. A much bigger potential public relations problem reared its head when McChrystal was contacted by Donald Rumsfeld's office and was told that President Bush was addressing the prestigious White House Correspondents' Dinner within a matter of days and wanted to mention Pat Tillman. McChrystal responded with an urgent personal memo known as a P4 to his superiors, Generals Abizade, Kensinger, and Brown, warning them of the impending speeches and that it was, quote, highly possible, unquote, that fratricide was the cause of Tillman's death. He also forwarded the same information to the highest levels of the White House and the Department of Defense. Several days later, Bush made no mention of the allegedly heroic circumstances as to how Tillman died. Instead, he merely stated, quote, the loss of Army Captain Pat Tillman last week in Afghanistan brought home the sorrow that comes with every loss and reminds us of the character of the men and women who serve on our behalf, unquote. On May 3rd, 2,000 individuals gathered in San Jose, and a national television audience watched Pat Tillman's memorial service in its entirety on at least one channel, ESPN. with highlights broadcast on other outlets. Lieutenant General Kinsinger was present and even met with the Tillman family, offering condolences but never informing them of the actual circumstances of their son's death. Regardless of one's political perspective, the initial news of Tillman's death was a sobering shock, and his memorial had the overtones of immense tragedy, as Pat's friends, comrades, and relatives described his unique spirit, selflessness, and dedication. No more so when a friend of Pat and Kevin's and Navy SEAL Steve White eulogized him by summarizing his Silver Star citation, authorized and approved by Stanley McChrystal and others. Quote, "He made the call. He dismounted his troops, taking the fight to the enemy, uphill, to seize the tactical high ground from the enemy. This gave his brothers and the downed vehicle time to move off that target. He directly saved their lives with that move. Pat sacrificed himself so his brothers could live." Unquote. White had been given this information by U.S. Army officials and had no idea that it was completely false from beginning to end. Both White and Russell Baer presented the Tillman family with folded American flags at the conclusion of the ceremony. Baer did know the actual details of Pat's death, but was still ordered to remain silent. After getting through the ordeal of having dinner that night with the Tillman family, he was so disturbed that instead of reporting to Fort Lewis, he briefly went AWOL. After one more tour of duty in Afghanistan, disillusioned, he left the military. Ironically, it was Kevin Tillman's presence within the Rangers that forced the Army's hand in revealing finally what happened to Pat Tillman. Kevin Tillman had been granted leave and was not expected back at Fort Lewis until his platoon unit returned from Afghanistan on May 22nd. By then, all of the members of Pat's platoon and many other Rangers returning to Fort Lewis would know the story. It was only a matter of time before somebody told Kevin Tillman what happened. Thus, the task of informing Pat's brother of the truth was given to a lowly staff sergeant who had commanded Kevin in the field, Thomas Fuller. Within days of Kevin reuniting with his unit, he was called into Fuller's base office and told generally with very little specifics that Pat Tillman may have been killed by friendly fire. Since Kevin Tillman only had the official Silver Star account to go by, the information made little sense. Kevin was also told that to help break the news to Kevin's parents, the lieutenant colonel and battalion commander of Pat's unit, Jeffrey Bailey, would accompany both Marie and Kevin to Northern California later that week. Bailey assured both Marie and Kevin that there would be no official release of information until after May 28th, the date that Bailey intended to fly to the Bay Area and meet with the Tillmans. Unbeknownst to Bailey, behind the scenes at both the Army Department and the Department of Defense, a tense and focused discussion was taking place as to exactly how this information should be disseminated. Donald Rumsfeld's press spokesman and general fixer, Lawrence DeRita, stated that since the Army was completely involved, it was up to the Army to break the news, and Rumsfeld's office shouldn't be involved in any way. Eventually, it was agreed that General Kinsinger would make a statement but take no questions from the press. The press briefing was scheduled for the next day, May 29th. Unfortunately, as is frequently the case, whether deliberately or accidentally, this news was leaked. On May 28th, an Arizona Republic newspaper reporter left a message for Danny Tillman to call her. When she called back, he asked her if she had any comment concerning her son, Pat Tillman, being the victim of friendly fire. Pat's mother was too shocked to even reply. This was how she first was informed of at least the partial truth concerning her son's death. The next day, General Kinsinger gave a 6-sentence statement announcing officially that Pat Tillman, quote, probably died, unquote, as a result of friendly fire, that the incident was regrettable, had been completely investigated, and there had been no finding of fault. He also stated that he would not take questions. On June 16th, the Tillman family was officially briefed on the circumstances of Pat's death by Bailey and James Nixon, the regiment's commanding officer. This 3-hour presentation raised more questions than it answered. The Tillmans were also made aware of the disciplinary actions meted out as a result of the incident. The officers involved in ordering the breakup of the column, David Hodney and William Saunders, were given written reprimands. all 4 machine gunners in the Humvee responsible for shooting at Tillman et al. Were kicked out of the Rangers and sent back to the regular Army. David Uthlout was also kicked out of the Rangers, ostensibly because he split up the column, when in fact he was opposed to this maneuver and said so repeatedly. Bailey and Nixon, most likely as a result of managing the optics successfully and hoodwinking the press and the public, were both promoted, Bailey to colonel, Nixon to brigadier general. The Tillman family from this moment on began a lengthy attempt to find out exactly what happened to their son and to attempt to obtain official accountability at every level of the government. They were fortunate to initially recruit Arizona Senator John McCain to their cause. McCain and others able to instigate additional investigative efforts, 4 in total. These investigations took an ominous turn when Chief Medical Examiner Craig Malek, when asked publicly during an Inspector General's inquiry into the Tillman incident whether or not it was possible that Pat's death was deliberate, responded, quote, "Sure, because every story, including the current report, doesn't match the medical evidence," unquote. Malek also stated that it seemed unlikely that 3 wounds could be inflicted in such a specific area from a distance of 40 yards, and it was most likely that they were fired at a distance of approximately 10 yards, an assessment that indicated that Tillman was deliberately murdered. Malek was actually mistaken in his interpretation of the caliber of the bullets fired by Trevor Alders, which explained how he came to such a faulty conclusion. Unfortunately, this would set off a wave of conspiracy theories that would take years to erase. Over time, many of the participants in the incident would publicly come forward, usually after their military careers were over, or during the intensive investigations that continued. Many of these individuals were critical of the actual shooters involved, but contradicted the 10-yard theory, stating what happened was the result of chaos and overzealous inexperience. Initially, the Tillman family, and especially Danny Tillman, were very skeptical of anything the U.S. Army maintained about Pat Tillman's death. When asked directly if she believed that Tillman was murdered, she frequently responded by saying that she certainly couldn't rule it out. Believing that she would never get a credible investigation of that question from the U.S. government, in 2017 she coordinated with a retired former Delta Forces colonel named Steve Blaber to review all of the relevant government documentation and to even interview 14 of the actual participants. Ultimately, both Danny and Blaber came to the conclusion that while some terrible decisions were made at every level, the death of Pat Tillman was an accident, although neither were willing to absolve the remarkable deceit carried out by both the U.S. military and government. Kevin Tillman left the military when his hitch was up. Today he is a successful IT executive living in the Phoenix area. As a result of the incredible outpouring of support from the public, both financial and otherwise, Marie Tillman decided to start a foundation that funds education for U.S. military veterans. The biggest fundraising event for this organization, the Pat Tillman Foundation, is Pat's Run, a 4.2-mile race that concludes on the 42-yard line of Tillman's former Sun Devil Stadium, now renovated as Mountain America Stadium. Marie also remarried and is the mother of 5 children, including a son, Mac Patrick. Thank you for listening to part 2 of this podcast about the Pat Tillman affair. Information for this podcast came from the books Where Men Win Glory by John Krakauer and Boots on the Ground by Dusk by Mary Tillman. There are also additional photographs, bibliographical, and musical information at bitesizedbiographies.com. Thank you for listening, and please tell a friend about Bite-Sized Biographies.